Hi, this is Andrew from Unitarian Apologetics. Welcome to this very special presentation. Today we're going to be talking about the recent viral video of godlogic asking Alex O'Connor in the recent debate between David Wood and Alex O'Connor the question concerning Hebrews 11:26 and the reproach of Christ. And in this claim, godlogic displays a completely backwards eisegesis of Hebrews 11:26, where he reads it as if Christ existed in the time of Moses and threatened reproach upon Moses if he didn't leave Egypt. But we're going to show that this is not only incorrect, but borderline blasphemous, and that instead the text should be understood that Moses bore a reproach similar to that of Christ. Let's watch the clip.
Question for Alex. You mentioned in Hebrews 1 where, God is speaking, or God spoke to our, through prophets. Now he speaks to us through his son, and you're saying, where was Jesus then? Back then he should have been active. And so, regarding Hebrews, I just want to read you this and get your thoughts on this. Okay, it's Hebrews 11. Regarding Moses, it says, by faith, Moses, and I'm going to just skip down to 25 and 26 for time, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So how is it that Moses can be considering Christ's disapproval if Christ wasn't around for him to disapprove?
Okay, so let's pay attention to what he's saying here. He's saying that Moses valued the reproach of Christ more than the wealth and riches of Egypt. But the only way, according to godlogic, that he would have received the reproach is if he had stayed in Egypt. And so he's saying that Moses would have desired the riches of the reproach of Christ more than the wealth of Egypt, but the only way that he would receive the reproach of Christ is if he stayed in Egypt, which would mean that in order to receive the greater wealth of the reproach of Christ, he would have had to disobey God. So godlogic has this text completely backwards, and I'm going to demonstrate that throughout this video. So looking at the text here, it says that Moses considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. But he reads it as if Christ pre-existed back then and was threatening Moses with reproach if he didn't leave Egypt. But it says in the text that the reproach of Christ was a greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. Do you understand? Maybe I will say this one more time. And if you don't catch it this time, just rewind the video and watch this clip again and watch what I'm trying to say. If the reproach of Christ was a disapproval, Moses considered the disapproval a greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. The only way that he could have had this disapproval is if he stayed in Egypt. And so if Moses considered this reproach or disapproval, godlogic says, a greater wealth, then he would have just stayed in Egypt. But that's not what the text says. It says by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king. We're going to see that it's actually Pharaoh and Pharaoh's servants and even the Israelites at times who gave this reproach to Moses. And that what's being talked about here is a reproach similar to that which Christ would later receive. And all of them by faith were leaving and doing something for the reward that was ahead of them. Okay, so demonstrating that this reproach was from Pharaoh, we know that in Hebrews 11:24, just 2 verses earlier, it says, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God. And so Moses rejected his privileged status and all the benefits of that, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God. So suffering affliction is part of this reproach that he did suffer. So godlogic is saying that Moses wanted to avoid reproach, when to the contrary, Moses embraced this reproach on behalf of God's people and with God's people. We also read in Exodus 10:28, when Moses demanded the release of the Israelites, Pharaoh said to Moses, "Make sure you never see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you will die." And so here again is reproach from Pharaoh, who wants to now kill him if Moses sees his face again. Okay, and this is the theme the author of Hebrews is telling us here. The very next chapter, it says, "Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." And so Jesus, like Moses, did not fear that which was coming ahead and would rather embrace the reproach from the world rather than enjoy the riches of Egypt, or in the case of Christ, enjoying his privilege on earth. Again, back to the text, Moses considered the reproach of Christ, so this is a reproach similar to that which Christ faced, greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. And it tells us that this reproach is coming from Pharaoh in the very next verse. By faith, Moses left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. So this reproach is coming from Pharaoh. And again, let's read this text. He sees the reproach of Christ there as disapproval from Christ. And so let's read his interpretation into the text. He would be saying that Moses considered the disapproval of Christ a greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. That's a completely backwards reading. It doesn't make any sense. And we're going to see throughout this video that what's being talked about here is a reproach similar to that which Christ was reproached with later in his ministry. We read here again, just another chapter later, Hebrews 13:12-13. It's going to tell us to bear the same reproach which Christ bore. And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to sanctify the people by his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp, bearing the reproach that he bore. And reproach here is the same word used for reproach in Hebrews 11:26. And so again here, the reproach is that which Christ bore. And Moses bore the same reproach from the world, this mocking and insulting and violence from the world that Christ was reproached with. And so the same way that Moses was reproached by Pharaoh and Pharaoh's servants and even the people of God at times, is the same way that Christ was later condemned by the Jewish authorities, mocked and beaten, rejected by his own people, and treated like a criminal when he was hung on a cross. The reproach is that which is like the reproach of Christ, not a reproach from Christ. And all throughout the Bible, we read that it's actually God who's saving his people from the reproach of foreign people, not God who's the one giving the reproaches. God is the one who's saving people from reproaches. And so when you say that Christ is doing something so evil, it is borderline blasphemous. All right, let's look at this great commentary from Brian Small, The Characterization of Jesus in the Book of Hebrews. And both of the commentaries I'm going to look at give two levels of meaning of the reproach of Christ. The first definition here by Small is a reproach like that endured by Christ. Moses endured the same type of reproach which Christ himself later suffered. Moses' reproach was a prefiguring of the reproach of Christ. So Christ is not the one threatening or handing out reproach. He is the one who has reproach put on him, just like Moses did prior to Christ. And so if we take this understanding, now we can give an interpretive translation of Hebrews 11:26. It would say that Moses valued a reproach like that endured by Christ above the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his reward. And so both Christ and Moses valued this reproach more than any treasures that could be had on earth. The second level of understanding for reproach, he says that this is understood as a reproach for the sake of Christ. And you'll see some interpretations actually do interpret it like this, as a reproach for Christ. For instance, if you read in the NIV translation, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. He goes on to say, as a prophet, Moses anticipated or foresaw Christ, the Messiah, and embraced his reproach for himself. Just as Moses embraced the reproach of Christ, the author also later urges the audience to bear his reproach. And again, here we see this in Hebrews 13. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp, bearing the reproach he bore. And so the reproach of Christ is a reproach like that which Christ bore himself, not the reproach which Christ was giving. Again, that interpretation is borderline blasphemous. Another interesting use of this word here for reproach we see in the New Testament is in Romans 15:3. It says, for Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. So these are the reproaches which are given to God. And it's saying here in Psalm 69:9 that the reproaches of those who reproached you, God, fell on me. And so these people not only reproach God, they reproach Christ, they reproached Moses, and they reproached the people of God. Okay, so godlogic's interpretation here is completely backwards. God and Christ and Moses and the people of God are the one receiving reproaches from the world and their leaders, not the ones who are giving out reproach or who made people fear reproach. Okay, another great commentary we'll look at where he gives two levels of meaning of this text is the Anchor Bible commentary by Craig Koester on Hebrews. He says, the Christological sense of the text has both primary and secondary levels of meaning. A, reproach like that endured by Christ is the primary sense. Christ was reviled after his arrest and again at the time of the crucifixion. Moses suffered verbal opposition from the king of Egypt and some of his own people. The listeners had borne similar denunciation in the past and would probably do so again. And so this reproach is coming from the world and their people against God's people, against Christ, against Moses, against the Israelites and the Christians. The secondary level of meaning he gives is again reproach for the sake of Christ. He says that some have argued that Moses suffered because of his expectations or visions of the Messiah. It is more likely, however, that the author is fusing the story of Moses with the experience of the listeners who had been denounced because of their faith in Christ. And so again, it's calling people to bear the same reproach which Christ himself bore. Not that Christ is handing out reproach. And so again here, godlogic's interpretation is that Christ is threatening reproach. But the Bible tells us that God, Christ, Moses, and their people have been reproached by the world and their rulers and even some of God's own people. And so what godlogic does here is he frames the question in a way that's misleading and ignorant of what the text is saying. And truly the blind lead the blind, because you'll see in this video, after he does this, that the people begin to giggle and gloat in their foolish pride, thinking they've proven a point when they've just exhibited their ignorance of the Bible. Now, I mean this in all love and sincerity, that I hope that godlogic will have the integrity to acknowledge that he's wrong about this text and that he's misled not only Alex but the entire audience and everyone who's accepted this blind reading and perversion of what Hebrews 11:26 says.